August 15, 1976. The Mid-South Coliseum in Memphis is buzzing with anticipation. 15,000 fans are packed into their seats, waiting for the king of rock and roll to take the stage. Outside, the summer heat is stifling, but inside the venue's backstage corridors, something unprecedented is about to unfold. A man in wrinkled khakis and a plain white t-shirt approaches the security checkpoint near the dressing rooms. His hair is disheveled, his face puffy and tired. He's carrying no identification, no backstage pass, no entourage trailing behind him. Just a middle-aged man who looks like he's been through hell. "Sir, you can't be back here," the security guard says, stepping forward with authority. "This is Elvis Presley's dressing room area, artists and crew only." The man looks up, his eyes bloodshot but unmistakably familiar to anyone who's ever seen them before. "I am Elvis Presley," he says quietly. The security guard doesn't just laugh, he actually calls for backup over his radio. "We've got another Elvis impersonator trying to get backstage. Yeah, this one's pretty committed to the bit." But here's the thing that will make your blood run cold. It actually was Elvis Presley. The real Elvis. The man who sold over 1 billion records, whose face was more recognizable than the president's, whose voice had launched 1,000 dreams and broken just as many hearts. And his own security team, people being paid to protect him, couldn't recognize him. How does the most famous man in America become invisible to his own people? How does a living legend become so lost inside his own empire that he's treated like a stranger at the gates of his own kingdom? What happened that night in Memphis would expose the most devastating truth about Elvis Presley's life. Not his music, not his movies, not his comeback specials. This is about how fame became a prison so complete that Elvis Presley disappeared inside of it, leaving behind a shell that even his closest allies couldn't identify. This isn't just another Elvis story. This is the story of how the king of rock and roll became a ghost haunting his own life. And what we discovered about that night will change everything you thought you knew about the price of being Elvis Presley. To understand how Elvis Presley could become unrecognizable to his own people, you have to understand what 1976 looked like from inside the bubble that had formed around him. From the outside, Elvis was at the absolute peak of his powers. His touring schedule was relentless, over 130 shows that year alone. Every single concert sold out within hours. The money was pouring in like a waterfall. But money can't buy you back your soul. And by August of 1976, Elvis Presley was living proof of that brutal truth. The transformation had been gradual, so slow that nobody inside his inner circle wanted to admit what they were watching happen. It started with the prescription medications, pills to help him sleep after the adrenaline rush of performing, pills to help him wake up and face another day, pills to manage the chronic pain from years of high-energy performances, and a body that was breaking down under the pressure. Dr. George Nishapoulos, Elvis's personal physician, would later admit he was prescribing over 10,000 pills a year to Elvis by 1976. 10,000. That's nearly 30 pills every single day. Uppers, downers, painkillers, sedatives, a chemical cocktail that was slowly rewiring not just Elvis's brain, but his entire physical appearance. His face had become puffy and bloated. The sharp cheekbones that had driven teenage girls wild in the 50s were buried under layers of medication-induced swelling. His legendary smile looked forced, tired. His eyes, those piercing blue eyes that had once been able to command any room, were often glazed, distant, like he was looking at the world through frosted glass. But the physical changes were nothing compared to what was happening to Elvis's connection with reality. Graceland had become more than his home, it had become his fortress. And inside that fortress, Elvis was surrounded by people whose entire livelihoods depended on keeping him happy, keeping him performing, keeping the money machine running. Colonel Tom Parker, his manager since 1955, had built an empire around Elvis. But somewhere along the way, the empire had started to matter more than the king. Parker controlled every aspect of Elvis's professional life with an iron fist. Who he performed with, where he performed, what songs he sang, what movies he made, all of it filtered through Colonel Parker's vision of what Elvis Presley should be. And here's the sick irony. Parker had become so invested in the image of Elvis that he'd lost track of the actual man. Elvis wasn't allowed to tour internationally because of Parker's immigration issues. He wasn't allowed to take acting roles that might challenge him because Parker thought they were too risky. He wasn't even allowed to choose his own songs without Parker's approval. Elvis had become a prisoner of his own success, surrounded by people who claimed to love him but who really loved what he could do for them. His entourage, the group fans called the Memphis Mafia, were more like enablers than friends. They brought him pills when he asked for them, laughed at his jokes even when they weren't funny, agreed with whatever he said even when he was clearly wrong. Joe Esposito, his road manager and closest friend, would later say that by 1976, it had become almost impossible to have a real conversation with Elvis. He was so used to everyone saying yes that he'd forgotten what it felt like to hear no, Esposito admitted years later. And we were all so afraid of upsetting him that we'd stopped being honest with him. The isolation was complete. Elvis would spend days at a time without leaving Graceland, staying up all night watching movies in his private screening room, sleeping through most of the day, emerging only when it was time to travel to the next concert. He'd lost touch with the rhythm of normal life, lost touch with what it felt like to move through the world as a regular person. But perhaps most tragically, he'd lost touch with himself. The Elvis who had walked into Sun Records in 1954 as a shy 19-year-old kid with a guitar and a dream. That person was buried so deep under layers of medication, manipulation, and manufactured image that sometimes Elvis himself couldn't find him. His daughter Lisa Marie, only 8 years old in 1976, would later remember visiting her father during this period and feeling like she was talking to a stranger who looked like her dad, but acted completely different. Sometimes I'd catch him looking in the mirror, she recalled, and he'd have this expression on his face like he didn't recognize the person looking back at him. This was the Elvis Presley who decided, on that sweltering August night in 1976, to do something he hadn't done in years. Show up somewhere unannounced, without handlers, without an entourage, without the elaborate security and publicity machine that had surrounded him for 2 decades. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was loneliness, maybe it was a desperate attempt to feel like a normal person again, to remember what it was like to just be a guy who wanted to see a show. Whatever the reason, Elvis Presley got in his car that night and drove to his own concert. He didn't call ahead. He didn't coordinate with security. He didn't even dress the part. He just showed up at the Mid-South Coliseum like any other fan who wanted to get a glimpse of Elvis Presley. The problem was, Elvis Presley had become so disconnected from his own identity that, when he finally tried to reclaim it, nobody believed it was really him. What happened next would shatter everything Elvis thought he knew about loyalty, friendship, and the price of fame. But what Elvis discovered that night would reveal the most painful truth about his life and the people who claimed to protect him. Elvis stood there in that backstage corridor, staring at the security guard who had just called him a fake. For a moment, he couldn't process what was happening. This was his concert. These were his people. This was his world. But somehow he'd become a stranger in it. "Listen," Elvis said, his voice carrying that familiar Memphis drawl that had made him famous. "I know this seems crazy, but I really am Elvis Presley. Just call Colonel Parker. He'll straighten this out." The security guard, a heavy-set man named Bobby Jenkins who'd been working venue security for 15 years, looked Elvis up and down with the kind of pity you'd reserve for someone who was clearly having a mental breakdown. "Sir, I've been doing this job a long time. You wouldn't believe how many guys show up here claiming to be Elvis. Some of them are pretty good, I'll give you that. but you're not even close." The words hit Elvis like a physical blow. Not even close. He touched his face instinctively, feeling the puffiness around his eyes, the weight he'd gained, the way his features had changed. When was the last time he'd really looked at himself in a mirror? Really looked, not just glanced while someone was getting him ready for a show. "Please," Elvis said, and there was something desperate in his voice now. "Just get Tom Parker. Tell him Elvis is here. He'll come." Bobby Jenkins sighed and radioed for his supervisor. Within minutes, Jerry Morrison, the venue's head of security, arrived. Morrison had worked dozens of Elvis shows over the years. He'd coordinated with Elvis's own security team countless times. If anyone should recognize Elvis Presley, it would be Jerry Morrison. Morrison took one look at the disheveled man in front of him and shook his head. "Buddy, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but it's not funny anymore. Elvis Presley is one of the most recognizable faces in the world. You think I wouldn't know Elvis if I saw him?" The cruel irony wasn't lost on Elvis. He was one of the most recognizable faces in the world, or at least, he had been. But the face these men were looking at wasn't the face from the album covers or the movie posters. It wasn't even the face from the comeback special in '68. This was the face of a man who'd been slowly disappearing inside his own fame for years. "I'll prove it to you," Elvis said, his voice getting stronger. And right there in that sterile backstage corridor, surrounded by skeptical security guards and venue staff who were starting to gather to watch the spectacle, Elvis Presley began to sing. "Wise men say, only fools rush in." The voice that emerged was unmistakably his. Even altered by medication, even roughened by years of prescription drug use, there was no mistaking that sound. It was the voice that had sold over 1 billion records, the voice that had changed the course of popular music forever. But Jerry Morrison just laughed. "That's pretty good, I'll give you that. You've been practicing. But Elvis Presley doesn't just show up at venues in street clothes without security. He doesn't walk through employee entrances like some random guy off the street. Nice try, though." Elvis felt something crack inside his chest. These people who worked his shows, people who made their living from his performances, they couldn't see him, the real him. They could only see the image, the manufactured version that had been sold to them for so many years that it had become more real than reality itself. "Call the dressing room," Elvis demanded. "Call my people, ask for Joe Esposito, ask for Charlie Hodge, they'll tell you." Morrison, more out of exhaustion than belief, finally agreed to make the call. He walked over to a house phone and dialed the number for Elvis's dressing room. The conversation that followed would haunt Elvis for the rest of his life. "Yeah, this is Jerry Morrison, venue security," Morrison said into the phone. "Listen, I've got a guy here claiming to be Elvis, says you'll vouch for him." There was a pause. "No, Elvis is already here. He's been in the dressing room for an hour getting ready." Another pause. "Okay, thanks." Morrison hung up and turned back to Elvis with a mixture of annoyance and pity. "They said Elvis is already here, preparing for the show. So whatever scam you're running, it's over. I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises." But Elvis knew something Morrison didn't know. Elvis wasn't in that dressing room. He was standing right here being treated like a delusional fan, which meant that someone else was in his dressing room, pretending to be him. One of his body doubles, maybe, or just someone from his entourage covering for his absence. The realization hit him like a freight train. His own people didn't even know he was missing. They were so used to managing his image, so used to the elaborate charade that surrounded his every move, that they were perfectly capable of running an Elvis Presley show without Elvis Presley. "Who did you talk to?" Elvis asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Charlie Hodge," Morrison replied. "He said Elvis is getting ready and doesn't want to be disturbed." Charlie Hodge, one of his oldest friends, a man who'd been by his side for over a decade, and Charlie had just denied that Elvis was standing outside his own concert venue. Elvis tried calling the dressing room himself from Morrison's phone. When Charlie answered, Elvis said, "Charlie, it's me. It's Elvis. I'm outside the venue and security won't let me in." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Charlie's voice, cautious and confused, "Who is this? This isn't Elvis. Elvis is right here." "Charlie, listen to my voice. You've known me for 15 years. This is Elvis." Another pause. "Look, whoever this isn't funny. Elvis doesn't make prank calls before shows. Stop calling this number." The line went dead. Elvis stood there holding the phone, staring at it like it might offer some explanation for what was happening to his life. His own best friend, a man who'd harmonized with him on hundreds of songs, who traveled with him around the country, who knew his voice better than almost anyone alive, couldn't recognize him through a phone call. Jerry Morrison was getting impatient. "All right, show's over. I'm calling the police if you don't leave right now." But Elvis couldn't leave. 15,000 people were in that arena waiting for him. His band was probably wondering where he was. The show was supposed to start in less than an hour. And here he was, locked out of his own concert, being threatened with arrest for trying to be himself. "Please," Elvis said one more time. "Just let me talk to Colonel Parker, just for 1 minute. If he says I'm not Elvis, I'll leave and never come back." Morrison looked at him for a long moment. Maybe it was the desperation in Elvis's voice. Maybe it was something familiar in his eyes that Morrison couldn't quite place. Whatever it was, he finally nodded. "Fine, 1 minute. But when Parker tells you to get lost, you're gone." What happened next would expose the most painful truth about Elvis Presley's life, and the people who claimed to protect him. Jerry Morrison led Elvis through the backstage maze toward Colonel Parker's office. With each step, Elvis felt his heart pounding. If anyone would recognize him, it had to be Parker. 21 years together, they'd built an empire. But as they approached the door, Elvis heard Parker's booming voice from inside. "No interviews tonight. Elvis isn't feeling well. He'll do the show, but that's it. Tell them he's got a sore throat." Elvis froze. Parker was making excuses for him, but Elvis wasn't sick. He was standing right here. Morrison knocked. "Colonel, we've got a situation." The cramped office smelled of cigar smoke and cheap coffee. Colonel Tom Parker sat behind a folding table, his massive frame squeezed into a metal chair. Hawaiian shirt, gold chains, that ever-present cigar. Parker glanced at Elvis for maybe 2 seconds, then looked back at Morrison. "What's the problem?" Elvis felt like he'd been punched. Parker had looked right through him. "This man claims he's Elvis Presley," Morrison explained. "Been causing problems backstage." Parker studied Elvis with the patience you'd show a persistent child. "Son, I've managed Elvis Presley for 21 years. I'd know him anywhere." He waved dismissively. "This ain't him." The words hit like bullets. 21 years of partnership. Sun records to Vegas. Every major decision, every triumph, every crisis. And Parker was staring at him like a complete stranger. "Colonel," Elvis said, his voice trembling. "It's really me. Look at my eyes. You know me better than anyone." Parker actually chuckled. "Nice try, kid. But Elvis Presley is in his dressing room right now, going over tonight's set list with his band." "No, I'm not," Elvis said desperately. "I drove here myself. No security, no handlers. I wanted to surprise everyone." "Elvis Presley doesn't drive himself anywhere," Parker said with absolute certainty. "He doesn't show up in street clothes, and he sure doesn't look like." He gestured at Elvis's wrinkled khakis and t-shirt. "Like this." There it was, the brutal truth Elvis had been avoiding. He'd become so removed from his own life that even his manager couldn't recognize the real version. Parker only knew the manufactured Elvis, jumpsuits, entourages, perfect grooming. "Call the dressing room," Elvis begged. "Ask them what Elvis is wearing right now." Parker sighed and picked up the phone. "Charlie, yeah, describe Elvis for me. What's he got on? Pause. White jumpsuit with gold trim, looking good. Another pause. Been there the whole time, okay. He hung up and looked at Elvis with pity. Charlie says Elvis is in his white jumpsuit, perfect health, been rehearsing for an hour. But Elvis was wearing khakis, which meant whoever was in that dressing room was lying, or Charlie was lying, or everyone was lying. The realization crashed over him. His people had been covering his absences so long they'd perfected pretending he was there when he wasn't. They could manufacture his presence. "Colonel," Elvis whispered, "how long has this been going on? How many shows have you done without me?" For the first time, Parker's confidence cracked. Something flickered across his face. "I don't know what you mean," Parker said, but uncertainty crept into his voice. "Yes, you do." Elvis's voice grew stronger with building rage. "How many times have you told people I was somewhere when I wasn't? How many decisions have you made without asking me? How many times have you used my name while I was drugged unconscious at Graceland?" Parker stood abruptly. "This conversation is over. Jerry, remove this disturbed individual immediately." But 21 years of fury was erupting. "You turned me into a ghost, Tom. You made me so dependent on pills and handlers that I can't even get into my own concert. You stole my life and sold it back to me in pieces." Parker's face went red. "Get security. I want this maniac arrested." But Morrison was staring at Elvis strangely. Something in his voice was finally breaking through. "Wait, sing something, say something else." Elvis looked directly at Parker and sang with all his pain, "Are you lonesome tonight? Do you miss me tonight?" The voice that filled that office was unmistakably Elvis Presley. Not polished Vegas Elvis or young rockabilly Elvis, but the real man underneath everything. Raw, broken, desperate, but absolutely authentic. Parker's face went white. His cigar dropped from his mouth. "Jesus Christ," Morrison whispered, "it really is you." Parker stared in horror, his mind racing. How had Elvis gotten here without anyone knowing? More importantly, how long had Elvis been absent while Parker told everyone he was fine? "How many shows, Tom?" Elvis asked quietly. "How many times have you sent body doubles while I was unconscious? How many contracts have you signed while I was too drugged to know what was happening?" Parker's silence was the answer. "My God," Elvis said, understanding flooding over him. "You've been running my career without me, making millions off my name while I disappeared into those pills you never tried to stop me from taking. You needed me sick, didn't you? Easier to control." "Elvis, you don't understand the pressures," Parker stammered. "I understand perfectly. You've been using my corpse as a puppet while you collected the money." Morrison backed toward the door, realizing he was witnessing something catastrophic. "How many people know?" Elvis demanded. "Charlie, obviously, Joe, the whole Memphis Mafia. How many of my friends have been lying while you controlled my life?" Parker finally found words. "The tour, the commitments, people were depending." "People were depending on Elvis Presley," Elvis cut him off. "Not some con game you've been running. Those fans tonight think they're seeing me, but they're not, are they?" The silence was deafening. 21 years of partnership crumbling in minutes. "You're fired," Elvis said quietly. Parker's face went purple. "You can't fire me, I have contracts." "You have nothing. Everything you built was a lie, and now it's over." But the most devastating discovery was still coming. One that would destroy everything Elvis thought he knew about his own career. The confrontation in that office wasn't just Elvis firing his manager. It was the moment Elvis Presley discovered he'd been dead for years, and nobody had bothered to tell him. After firing Parker, Elvis did something revolutionary. He walked onto that stage and performed without preparation, without his usual pre-show ritual, without the machinery that had controlled every Elvis performance for a decade. It was one of the best shows of his life. Jerry Morrison, watching from the wings, said Elvis seemed reborn that night. It was like watching a man remember who he used to be. He wasn't performing Elvis Presley. He was being Elvis Presley. But the euphoria couldn't hide what Elvis had learned. Returning to Graceland the next morning, he began the most painful investigation of his life, discovering how much of his career had been real. The truth was devastating. For 3 years, body doubles had performed at dozens of his shows when Elvis was too medicated to appear. Sometimes during opening songs while Elvis was rushed to the venue. Sometimes for entire concerts while Elvis lay unconscious at home. The audience never knew. His own band sometimes didn't know. Dave Hebler, his bodyguard, later confessed they developed an entire system. We had guys who could mimic his voice, guys who looked like him from a distance, guys who knew his moves. The colonel said it was temporary until Elvis got healthy, but it kept happening. The body doubles were just the beginning. Elvis found contracts he'd never seen, business deals he'd never agreed to, creative decisions made without him. Parker had been running the Elvis empire like Elvis was already dead. The prescription drugs had made Elvis compliant, manageable. While he floated in a medicated haze, others lived his life, made his choices, spent his money, controlled his legacy. The most heartbreaking discovery: letters from studios, labels, promoters, offers that could have revitalized his career, creative opportunities that could have challenged him as an artist, all rejected by Parker without Elvis knowing they existed. Steven Spielberg had wanted Elvis for a dramatic role. The Beatles had approached him about collaboration, international tour that could have introduced Elvis to new audiences worldwide. All dismissed by Parker, who preferred safe, predictable, controllable Vegas residencies. Elvis realized he hadn't just been imprisoned by success, he'd been buried alive by it. But the cruelest revelation was how many people in his inner circle had known and stayed silent. The Memphis Mafia, his supposed best friends, had watched him disappear into addiction and manipulation without intervening. They'd enabled the deception because their livelihoods depended on the Elvis machine running, even without a real Elvis inside it. Red West, one of his oldest friends, later admitted his guilt. We told ourselves we were protecting him. Really, we were protecting ourselves. We were afraid if Elvis got clean, took control again, he wouldn't need us anymore. The weeks after that August night brought legal battles, firings, and desperate attempts by Elvis to reclaim his life. He hired new management, fired most of his entourage, tried getting clean from the medications that had stolen years. But the damage was done. Elvis's health had deteriorated beyond repair. His heart was damaged from prescription abuse. His liver was failing. His body had aged decades in a few years. More tragically, Elvis's sense of self was so thoroughly destroyed he couldn't remember who he really was underneath the manufactured image. In his final months, he'd sit at Graceland's piano, playing songs he'd loved as a teenager, trying to find his way back to the person he'd been before the world decided who Elvis Presley should be. Lisa Marie remembered those late-night piano sessions. He'd play old gospel songs and cry. He'd say, "I don't know who I am anymore, baby. I don't know which version of me is real." The tragedy of Elvis isn't just dying at 42. It's that he'd been dying for years while everyone pretended he was fine. That night at the Mid-South Coliseum was when Elvis finally saw how completely he'd disappeared, not just from his life, but from his own identity. The man who couldn't get into his own concert had discovered something worse than being unrecognizable to strangers. He'd become unrecognizable to himself. In his final diary entry, 3 weeks before his death, Elvis wrote, "I feel like I've been invisible in plain sight my whole life. Everyone sees Elvis Presley, but nobody sees Elvis. Sometimes I wonder if there's any Elvis left to see." When Elvis died on August 16, 1977, exactly 1 year after confronting Parker, the world mourned the king of rock and roll. But those who knew understood Elvis Presley had been gone much longer. He'd been killed by the very success supposed to free him. The saddest part, nobody noticed he was missing until too late. Today, looking at celebrity culture, artists struggling with addiction, manipulation, identity loss, we see the same pattern that destroyed Elvis. The system that turns humans into products, values image over authenticity, prioritizes profit over the person creating art. Elvis's story isn't just about fame. It's a warning about letting others define who we are, becoming so disconnected from ourselves that we disappear inside our own lives. The king didn't die from heart failure. He died from a broken heart, the heart of a man who'd spent years trying to find himself, only to discover the person he'd once been had been erased by those who claimed to love him. In our age of social media and manufactured personas, we're all at risk of becoming invisible in plain sight. The question isn't whether we'll face the temptation to let others control our image. It's whether we'll have the courage to remain authentically ourselves when the world demands we become something else. Elvis Presley's final tragedy wasn't that he died young. It was that he died trying to remember who he'd been before he became Elvis Presley. And in the end, even he couldn't tell the difference between the man and the myth. Elvis spent his final months fighting to reclaim the man he'd lost inside the legend. The real tragedy isn't just that he died young, it's that he'd been disappearing long before that August night. In our world of social media and manufactured images, are we all becoming invisible in plain sight? Share your thoughts below about staying authentic in a fake world, and subscribe for more untold stories about the human cost of fame.